The village of Kivalina sat at the edge of the world, where frozen ocean met frozen land, and sometimes you couldn't tell the difference between the two. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where secrets were impossible to keep, and where the old stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival guides. Dr. James Rivera had been living there for 6 months now, studying how the warming climate was changing the Arctic. He was a marine biologist from California, and the contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Back home, he'd been surrounded by millions of people. Here, the entire village had fewer than 400 souls. James was 34 years old, though some days he felt much older. His marriage had fallen apart 2 years ago, and his daughter Maya barely spoke to him anymore. When the research opportunity in Alaska came up, he jumped at it. Getting lost in work seemed easier than facing what he'd lost. The villagers were friendly enough, but they kept their distance. James was an outsider, a scientist who'd come to study them like specimens under a microscope. He tried to be respectful, learning names, sharing meals, helping with repairs when he could, but there was always that invisible wall between him and the community. It was old Henry Blackwood who first told him about the Whisper Drift. They were sitting in the village's only store, drinking coffee that was more hot water than actual coffee. Outside, the February wind howled like a living thing trying to get inside. "You see that stretch of ice out there?" Henry pointed through the window toward the frozen expanse that connected their village to the mainland. "That's where the drift forms. When conditions are just right or just wrong, depending on how you look at it, the ice whispers." James had smiled politely. "Wind through ice formations, I imagine, creates interesting acoustic effects." Henry's weathered face had remained serious. "You can think that if you want, but 15 people have walked out onto that ice when the whispers come. 15 people over 40 years. Not one of them ever came back." The old man wasn't joking. James could see it in his eyes. This wasn't folklore meant to scare children. This was real fear, passed down through generations. "What happens to them?" James had asked. "Nobody knows. The fog rolls in thick as wool. The ice starts making sounds like voices calling out. People go out there to investigate, or they try to cross to the mainland, and they just vanish. We find their snowmobiles sometimes abandoned. Supplies scattered, but the people, gone." James learned more about the Whisper Drift in the following weeks. Everyone in the village had a story about it. Some claimed it was spirits of the dead, trapped under the ice. Others believed it was something in the water, some strange creature that lured people to their doom. A few thought it was magnetic anomalies that confused people until they died of exposure. The scientific part of James's brain was fascinated. The human part was skeptical. People got lost in whiteout conditions all the time in the Arctic. Add fog, wind, and panic, and it wasn't mysterious that people disappeared. It was tragic, but it wasn't supernatural. He said as much to Henry one evening. The old man had just shaken his head. "You scientists always think you have explanations for everything. Sometimes the old knowledge is there for a reason. Sometimes respecting what you don't understand keeps you alive." James had nodded, but he didn't really believe it. He respected the danger of the Arctic. He wasn't stupid, but he couldn't accept that some stretch of ice was cursed or haunted. There had to be a logical explanation for the disappearances. His research kept him busy enough that he didn't think much about the drift. He was documenting changes in fish populations, tracking ice thickness, measuring temperature variations. The work was meticulous and exhausting, which was exactly what he needed. When he was focused on data, he didn't have time to think about Maya's last words to him. "You care more about your work than you ever cared about us." She'd been right, and that made it hurt even more. The village rhythm was different from anything James had known. Life moved with the seasons, with the weather, with the migration of animals. There were no restaurants, no movie theaters, no distractions. When the sun disappeared for months at a time, people turned inward, their lives lit by generator-powered bulbs and the occasional magnificent display of northern lights. James found himself becoming part of the community almost by accident. He helped the Tanaka family repair their boat motor. He showed some of the kids how to use his microscope, letting them look at snowflakes and ice crystals. He learned to play cards the way the villagers played, for matchsticks, not money, with endless trash-talking and laughter. But the whisper drift remained off-limits. The one time James suggested studying the acoustic phenomena there, the reaction had been immediate and negative. "You don't go out there when it's whispering," Linda Takak had told him firmly. She ran the village store and was as close to a mayor as Kivalina had. "I don't care what fancy degrees you have. The drift has taken enough people. We're not losing anyone else." James had dropped the subject, but his curiosity remained. He started reviewing weather reports and historical records, trying to find patterns in the disappearances. They all seemed to happen during specific conditions: low-pressure systems combined with unusual wind patterns and heavy fog. There were also notes about compass malfunctions and GPS failures in the area. Magnetic anomaly, he thought. That would explain the navigation failures. Combined with poor visibility and acoustic confusion, people could easily become disoriented and walk in circles until hypothermia set in. He wrote up a report about it, sent it to his research supervisor back in California. The response was polite but dismissive. His job was to study marine biology, not local legends. "Stay focused," they told him, so he tried. But the drift lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. The winter deepened. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The supply plane that usually came every 2 weeks was grounded by storms. The village settled into a familiar pattern of waiting. Waiting for better weather, waiting for supplies, waiting for spring. James video called Maya twice during those weeks. Both times she'd answered briefly, her responses clipped and distant. She was 15 now, practically grown. She had her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn streak. She was doing fine in school, she said. Yes, she was eating well. No, she didn't need anything. The conversations lasted less than 5 minutes each. After the second call, James sat in his small research cabin staring at the blank screen, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him. He'd come to Alaska to escape his problems, but you can't outrun yourself. The isolation he'd sought was just loneliness with a fancy name. Outside, the ice groaned and cracked, adjusting to the temperature. The sound was like the earth itself sighing. James understood that sigh. He felt it in his bones, the heaviness of being alone in a vast, indifferent world. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. The storms that were battering the village were just the beginning. Within days, the whisper drift would stop being an interesting mystery and become a matter of life and death. And James would have to decide what he truly believed, in science, in community, and in himself. The storm hit on a Tuesday morning, and it didn't stop for 3 weeks. James had experienced bad weather before, but nothing like this. The wind screamed across the frozen landscape with a fury that shook his cabin. Snow fell so thick that he couldn't see 5 feet beyond his window. The temperature plummeted to 50 below, then kept dropping. The village hunkered down. Generator fuel was rationed. Families doubled up in homes to conserve heat. The supply plane couldn't fly in these conditions, and everyone knew it. They'd been through this before. It was part of Arctic life. You prepared, you waited, and you survived. But on day 17 of the storm, everything changed. Little Beth Park started complaining about stomach pain. Her mother, Julie, thought it was something she ate. But the pain got worse. By the next morning, Beth was crying, doubled over, running a fever that climbed higher every hour. Julie brought her to Tom Wheeler, the village's paramedic. Tom had medical training from the military, and he'd handled emergencies before. But when he examined 8-year-old Beth, his face went pale. "It's her appendix," he told Julie quietly. "It's going to rupture if we don't get her to a hospital. She needs surgery, and she needs it soon." The village gathered in the community center to figure out what to do. This was how Kivalina worked. Everyone's problem was everyone's problem. James stood in the back, listening. "The helicopter can't fly in this storm," Linda Takak said, her voice tight with worry. "I already called. They said maybe 4 or 5 days if the weather clears." "Beth doesn't have 4 or 5 days," Tom replied. "Maybe 24 hours, maybe less. If that appendix bursts..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "What about the ice road?" someone asked. Henry Blackwood shook his head. "Checked this morning. Storm broke up the main route. There's a pressure ridge running right through the middle. No vehicles getting across. The room fell silent. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it. Finally, Julie spoke, her voice breaking. What about the drift route? The silence got heavier. No, Henry said firmly. Absolutely not. The conditions out there right now, fogs rolling in, winds doing strange things, those are exactly the conditions when the drift whispers. My daughter is dying, Julie said, and tears were streaming down her face. I don't care about the drift. I don't care about the stories. She needs help. Julie, I understand, Linda started. Do you? Do you really? Because she's my baby and she's in there crying. And you're telling me we're just going to let her die because of some old superstition? Henry's face hardened. It's not superstition. It's 15 dead people. 15 families that lost someone they loved. You think I want to see Beth die? But I'm not sending anyone out there to die with her. The argument went on for another hour. People shouted, people cried, but nobody had a solution. The helicopter couldn't fly. The ice road was impassable. The drift was suicide. Beth needed surgery that couldn't happen in the village. James listened to all of it, his mind racing. He'd been studying the weather patterns for months. He'd looked at all the historical data on the disappearances. He'd formed theories about what was really happening out on the drift. But theories and real life were different things. One was data on a computer screen. The other was a little girl dying. He thought about Maya. If she were here, if she were sick, what would he want someone to do? The answer was obvious. James stepped forward. I'll go. The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at him. You'll what? Linda asked. I'll cross the drift. I'll get to the mainland medical center and bring back help. Henry stood up, his chair scraping loudly. You're out of your mind. You're not from here. You don't understand. I understand that a child is dying, James interrupted. I understand that someone needs to try, and I understand that I've spent 6 months studying the conditions out there. I have theories about what's really happening on the drift. Theories? Henry's voice was sharp. Son, theories don't keep you alive when the ice is whispering. Maybe not. But I'm going anyway. Julie was looking at him with desperate hope in her eyes. Tom Wheeler looked torn between relief and guilt. The rest of the village just looked shocked. Linda stepped closer to James. You know this is probably suicide, right? You know we've lost 15 people out there? I know. But I also know that doing nothing is definitely letting Beth die. At least this way, there's a chance. The debate continued, but James had made up his mind. He spent the rest of the day preparing. Tom gave him a satellite phone and made him promise to check in every 30 minutes. Henry, despite his objections, helped him pack proper cold weather gear and emergency supplies. You're a fool, Henry said as they loaded the snowmobile. But you're a brave fool. I'll give you that. James visited Beth before he left. She was lying in her mother's bed, pale and sweating. Julie sat beside her, holding her hand. Are you really going to help my Beth? Julie asked quietly. I'm going to try my best. Beth opened her eyes and looked at him. Everyone says the ice is scary. Are you scared? James thought about lying, about being brave for her. But something made him tell the truth instead. Yeah, I'm scared. But sometimes you have to do scary things for the people you care about. Beth smiled weakly. You're nice. Come back safe, okay? I'll do my best, kiddo. As James prepared to leave, half the village came out to see him off despite the brutal cold. Most of them thought they were watching him leave for the last time. He could see it in their faces, the mixture of hope and resignation. Tom pulled him aside one last time. Listen, if things go bad out there, if you get disoriented, just stop. Don't keep moving. Stay with your snowmobile. Use it as shelter and wait for the storm to clear. Better to be cold than lost. James nodded, though they both knew that advice might not be enough. He fired up the snowmobile, the engine roaring to life. The sky was that strange gray-white color that meant the storm wasn't quite done yet. Fog was already forming over the ice, wisps of it curling and drifting like living things. Linda came up to him, her expression serious. The first 2 miles are straightforward. After that, if the fog comes in thick, if you start hearing the whispers, James, people get confused out there. They turn around without knowing it. They drive in circles. Some of them are found miles in the wrong direction. I have GPS and a compass. The GPS doesn't work right out there. Neither does the compass. I don't know why, but they don't. You need to trust your instincts, and you need to remember that what you hear might not be real. James took a deep breath of air so cold it hurt his lungs. I've got to go. Beth doesn't have time. He put the snowmobile in gear and started forward onto the ice. Behind him, the village grew smaller. Ahead of him, the fog was growing thicker. The whisper drift was waiting. As he drove into that white emptiness, James thought about Maya, about Beth, about all the people who were counting on him. He thought about Henry's warnings and Linda's fear and Julie's desperate hope. And he wondered if this was how all the others had felt. The 15 people who'd gone out onto the drift and never come back. Had they been scared too? Had they been brave or just foolish? The fog swallowed him whole and the real journey began. For the first 2 miles, everything went fine. James kept the snowmobile at a steady pace, following the route he'd memorized from the maps. The ice beneath him was solid and visibility was decent enough to see about 20 feet ahead. He checked in with Tom on the satellite phone right on schedule. "I'm good," he reported. "No problems yet. Ice is stable. Copy that. Stay alert." The drift usually starts around the 3-mile mark. James continued forward, his eyes scanning the white landscape. The wind had died down to almost nothing, which should have been comforting, but somehow wasn't. The silence felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. At mile 3, the fog rolled in. It didn't creep or drift, it came like a wall, thick and white and absolute. One moment James could see ahead, and the next moment he was inside a cloud. The visibility dropped to nearly 0. He slowed the snowmobile to a crawl. That's when his GPS started acting strange. The screen flickered, showing his location jumping around randomly. 1 second it said he was exactly where he should be. The next second it showed him 2 miles north. Then south. Then the signal disappeared entirely. James pulled out his compass. The needle spun in slow circles, unable to find north. "Okay," he said out loud, trying to keep calm. "Magnetic anomaly, just like I thought. This is explainable. This is science." But his heart was beating faster. Theory was one thing. Being lost in the fog with no navigation was something else entirely. He stopped the snowmobile and pulled out the satellite phone to check in. "Tom, I've lost GPS and compass. The fog is thick. I'm going to proceed slowly and try to maintain a straight line." There was static on the line, then Tom's voice came through, breaking up. "Copy. Be careful. If you hear, don't... Tom? You're breaking up. Say again." More static. Then nothing. The phone showed no signal. James was completely alone now. He took a deep breath and started moving forward again, going barely faster than a walking pace. He kept his eyes on the ice directly in front of him, looking for any cracks or changes in surface. If he kept going straight, he reasoned, he'd eventually reach the mainland. It was only 8 miles total. He'd already covered 3. That's when he heard it. At first, James thought it was just wind. A low sound rising and falling. But the air was still, there was no wind. He stopped the snowmobile and turned off the engine, listening. The sound was coming from all around him, and it did sound like whispers. Not words exactly, but something that made his brain try to hear words. It was like listening to a conversation in another room, where you can hear the rhythm and tone but can't quite make out what's being said. "Acoustic phenomenon," James said out loud, using his own voice to fight the eeriness of it. "Wind through ice formations or water moving in caverns below. It's creating sound waves that the fog is amplifying." But even as he said it, his hands were shaking. The whispers grew louder, and then James heard something that made his blood run cold. They sounded like they were calling his name. No. That was his imagination. That was his brain trying to make patterns out of random noise. He knew about pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in clouds or hear words in random sounds. This was just that, nothing more. He started the snowmobile again and moved forward, trying to ignore the sounds, but they followed him. They grew louder, and they seemed to be coming from specific directions, pulling his attention left, then right, then behind him. James realized what was happening. This was how people got lost. The sounds disoriented them, made them turn around without realizing it, made them second-guess their direction until they had no idea which way they were going. He stopped again, forcing himself to think scientifically. The fog was maybe 10 feet thick above him. He could see it thinning toward the top. If he could just maintain direction somehow. That's when James noticed something. The whispers changed tone depending on which way he faced. When he turned left, they got higher pitched. When he turned right, they got lower. When he faced what he thought was forward, they had a middle tone. He experimented, turning in a slow circle. The pitch change was consistent. It was like the ice was giving off different frequencies in different directions. Echolocation, James whispered. The ice formations below are creating acoustic patterns. The sound bounces differently depending on the structure underneath. His scientific mind started racing. If the whispers changed pitch based on direction, that meant they were reflecting off something. And if they reflected consistently, he could potentially use them to navigate. It was insane. It was the exact opposite of what everyone had told him. Don't listen to the whispers, don't pay attention to them. But James had spent his entire career listening to what data told him, not what people assumed was true. He pulled out a small audio recorder from his emergency pack and started documenting the sounds. He turned slowly, recording the pitch changes. Then he reviewed the recording, listening carefully. There was a pattern. When he faced what he believed was toward the mainland, the whispers had a specific tonal quality. Multiple frequencies layered together. When he faced other directions, the frequencies were simpler. The complex sound had to mean something. Maybe there were multiple cavern systems in that direction, creating overlapping echoes, or maybe the ice was thicker there, creating more resonance chambers. Whatever the reason, James made a decision. He would follow the complex whispers. He would use the sound to navigate. He started the snowmobile and moved in the direction of the most complex acoustic pattern. Every 100 yards, he stopped and listened again, adjusting his course. The fog remained thick. The visibility remained terrible, but the whispers guided him. It felt like madness. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore the sounds, to trust his gut sense of direction instead. But his gut had no idea where north was. His gut was just guessing. The whispers, strange as they were at least consistent. Time became meaningless in the fog. James had no idea if he'd been out there for 1 hour or 3. His hands were numb despite the heavy gloves. His face hurt from the cold. But he kept going, kept listening, kept following the acoustic patterns, and then suddenly the whispers changed. They didn't get louder or softer. They got clearer, more focused. It was like moving from a room with bad acoustics to one with perfect sound. James stopped and listened carefully. He was hearing echoes now, distinct and separate. His own snowmobile engine was bouncing back to him from multiple directions. That meant he was surrounded by ice formations, probably pressure ridges or frozen structures. James pulled out his recorder again and made a sharp noise, a loud shout. He listened to how it echoed back. The sound returned from his right side faster than from his left. That meant the ice was closer on the right. He was in some kind of channel or passage. If he followed the channel, it might lead him through the maze of ice formations safely. If he went the wrong way, he might hit a dead end or a weak spot. But he had no choice. He moved forward slowly, using sound to map his surroundings. Every few minutes he'd make a noise and listen to the echoes. The fog made it impossible to see, but his ears were painting a picture of the ice around him. It was working. He was actually navigating by sound, using the same principle that bats and dolphins used. The whispers weren't trying to kill him. They were giving him information if he knew how to interpret it. After what felt like hours, the fog began to thin. James could see farther ahead, 20 feet, then 30, then 50. The whispers faded to a quiet background hum, and then he saw it. Solid land. The mainland coast. He'd made it across. James stopped the snowmobile and just sat there for a moment, shaking. Not from cold, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of being alive. He'd crossed the whisper drift. He'd listened to the sounds that had killed 15 people, and he'd survived. He grabbed the satellite phone. It had signal again. Tom? Tom, are you there?
James, thank God.
We lost your signal for over 2 hours. Are you okay? I'm across. I'm on the mainland. I'm heading to the medical center now. Get Beth ready. Help is coming. He could hear people cheering in the background. Julie was crying. Someone was thanking God. James fired up the snowmobile and headed for the medical center, which was only 3 miles from the coast. But his mind was still on the drift, on the whispers, on what he'd discovered. The ice wasn't haunted. It was talking, and he'd learned how to listen. The medical center was a small building with big responsibilities, serving dozens of remote communities scattered across the Arctic. James burst through the doors, still covered in frost, his face red from windburn. I need emergency transport, he gasped. Little girl, appendicitis, needs surgery immediately. Village of Kivalina. The staff moved fast. Within 20 minutes, they had a helicopter warming up. The pilot, a woman named Rachel Kim, looked at the weather data and shook her head. Storm's clearing, but there's still fog over the water. I can get there, but it'll be risky. A child is dying, James said simply. Rachel nodded. Then we go. The helicopter flight took 40 minutes. James watched the drift pass below them, that stretch of ice where he'd almost died. From up here it looked peaceful, innocent. You couldn't hear the whispers from the sky. When they landed in Kivalina, half the village was waiting. Julie ran to the helicopter before the blades even stopped spinning. The medical team loaded Beth carefully, hooking up IVs and monitoring equipment. She's stable enough for transport, the paramedic told Julie. But we need to move now. Julie grabbed James's hand. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how you did it, but thank you. James watched the helicopter take off again, carrying Beth toward surgery and hopefully toward survival. He was exhausted, frozen, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline crash. But he'd done it. Linda appeared beside him with a thermos of hot coffee. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both. I just did what needed doing. You crossed the drift, Henry said, walking up. His voice was strange, caught between respect and something else. Nobody's ever crossed the drift when it's whispering and come back. Not in 40 years, word spread fast. By evening, everyone knew that James had not only survived the crossing, but had a theory about how he'd done it. The village gathered again in the community center, and this time they wanted answers. James stood in front of them, feeling awkward and self-conscious. I'm not saying I have everything figured out, but I think I understand what's happening out there. He explained his theory as simply as he could. The underwater cavern systems, the acoustic patterns, how sound bounced differently depending on ice structure, how you could use those echoes to navigate, the same way bats and dolphins used echolocation. Some people listened with interest. Others looked skeptical. A few looked almost angry. So you're saying it's not spirits? Someone asked. You're saying it's just sound? I'm saying the whispers are real, but they're natural. They're created by wind and water moving through ice formations. The fog amplifies the sound. Your compass fails because there's a magnetic anomaly, probably iron deposits or something underground. GPS fails because of the interference. People got lost because they couldn't navigate, not because something supernatural killed them. Henry stood up, his face hard. I lost my son to the drift 20 years ago. You telling me that was just him getting confused by sounds? The room went very quiet. James chose his words carefully. I'm saying the conditions out there are incredibly dangerous. The fog is disorienting. The acoustic phenomena can mess with your sense of direction. Without proper navigation tools, it's easy to get turned around. The people who died, they weren't foolish. They were in an impossible situation. But now that we understand what's happening, maybe we can prevent more deaths. Or maybe, Henry said quietly, you just got lucky. Tom Wheeler spoke up. Lucky or not, he saved Beth's life. And if his theory is right, maybe he saved future lives too. Shouldn't we at least consider it? The debate went on for hours. The village was split. The younger people, especially those with education and exposure to the outside world, were more willing to accept James's scientific explanation. The elders, who'd grown up with the stories and who'd lost people to the drift, weren't ready to let go of their beliefs. But James wasn't done yet. Because in his mind a dangerous idea was forming. He had to go back. Not because anyone was asking him to. Not because there was an emergency, but because if his theory was right, he needed to prove it. He needed to cross the drift again, this time with proper documentation. If he could teach others to navigate using sound, the drift would stop being a death trap. That night, lying in his cabin, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the crossing, about the whispers, about how he'd felt when he realized the sound patterns were navigational tools. It had been terrifying and exhilarating all at once. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Maya gave me your number. This is Julie. Beth came through surgery. She's going to be okay. The doctor said another 6 hours and it would have been too late. You saved my daughter's life. I don't have words for what that means to me. James stared at the message, feeling something crack inside him. When was the last time he'd done something that really mattered? When was the last time he'd put someone else ahead of his own comfort, his own safety, his own needs? He thought about Maya, about all the times he'd chosen work over her recital, his research over her soccer game, his deadlines over her birthday. He'd told himself he was providing for her, building a career, doing important things, but he'd just been running away. From connection, from vulnerability, from the messy, difficult work of actually being present for someone. The next morning, James announced his plan. He was going to cross the drift again, this time in daylight, with recording equipment with a proper documentation of the acoustic navigation method, and he wanted to teach others to do it. "You're out of your mind," Linda said flatly. "You survived once. Don't push your luck. It's not luck. It's technique. And if I can teach people to navigate safely, think what that means. The drift won't be a barrier anymore. The village won't be cut off during emergencies. You'll have a reliable route to the mainland. Or you'll die trying to prove a point," Henry said. "And then what? Your daughter grows up without a father because you needed to be right?" That hit hard. James had to look away. "I've already lost my daughter," he said quietly. "I lost her before I even came here. I was so focused on my work, on my career, on proving how smart I was, that I forgot to actually be her dad. Maybe this is just more of the same. More ego, more proving myself. But maybe it's also the first time I'm doing something because it's genuinely right, not because it benefits me." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Tom spoke up. "If you're serious about this, you shouldn't go alone. Take someone with you. Teach them as you go. That way, if something happens to you, the knowledge doesn't die." "I'll go," said a young voice. Everyone turned. David Tanaka, barely 20 years old, stepped forward. "I'm young, I'm strong, and I've been listening to these stories my whole life. If there's a chance to finally understand the drift, to make it safe, I want to be part of that." His father, Robert Tanaka, looked torn between pride and fear. "David, Dad, how many times have we been cut off from the mainland? How many times have we gone without supplies or medical care because we couldn't cross? If James's theory is right, this changes everything." Henry stood up slowly. He looked at James, then at David, then at the gathered villagers. "My nephew wants to risk his life. You're asking me to support this? I'm asking you to consider that maybe there's a way forward that doesn't involve fear," James said. "The drift has controlled this village for 40 years. What if it doesn't have to anymore?" The debate raged again, but this time more voices were on James's side. The tide was turning. People wanted hope. They wanted to believe that the thing that had terrorized them for so long could be understood, could be overcome. But Henry remained unconvinced. And in his eyes, James saw something he understood all too well: the weight of old grief, the pain of loss that had never healed. "Your son," James said quietly, approaching Henry after the meeting ended. "What was his name?" Henry's face tightened. "Daniel, he was 25. Went out on the drift to retrieve some equipment we'd left on the ice. Said he'd be back in an hour. That was 20 years ago. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back. And your theory doesn't bring him back either. You want to know what I think? I think you're running from something just like my son was. Daniel was supposed to get married that summer. He was scared, getting cold feet. He went out on that ice because he needed to think. And he never came home." James felt like he'd been punched. "You think he went out there on purpose?" "I think he went out there confused and scared, and the drift took advantage of that. I think your fancy science doesn't account for the human heart. And I think you're making the same mistake, using this as an escape from whatever you're really afraid of." Henry walked away, leaving James standing in the cold, wondering if the old man was right. 3 days later, James stood at the edge of the drift again, but this time everything was different. The sun was shining, the weather was clear, and he wasn't alone. David Tanaka was beside him, checking equipment. Tom Wheeler was there to monitor their progress. And surprisingly, Henry had shown up too. "I'm not here to support this fool plan," Henry said gruffly. "I'm here to call it off if things go wrong." James had spent those 3 days preparing carefully. He'd created a detailed plan, tested his acoustic recording equipment, and most importantly, he'd spent hours teaching David the theory behind what he was about to do. Sound travels differently through different ice structures, James explained for the 10th time, wanting to make sure David really understood. When you hear the whispers change pitch or tone, that's telling you about what's beneath the ice. Complex sounds mean complex structures. Simple sounds mean simpler formations. We're going to map it as we go. David nodded, his young face serious. "And if we get separated?" "We don't get separated. We stay within sight of each other at all times. If fog rolls in and we can't see each other, we stop immediately and wait for it to clear. No exceptions. They'd rigged up a rope system connecting their two snowmobiles. Even in fog, they'd be physically linked. James had also brought flares, extra batteries, emergency shelters, and enough supplies for 3 days if they got stranded. Julie came to see them off, Beth bundled up beside her. The little girl was recovering well, though she'd need several more weeks of rest. "You brought my daughter back to me," Julie said to James. "Now come back safe yourself, okay?" Beth hugged James's leg. "Don't let the ice get you." "I won't, kiddo. I promise." The crossing started well. With clear weather and good visibility, the drift looked almost ordinary. Just another stretch of frozen ocean. James and David moved at a careful pace, stopping every few hundred yards to take readings and measurements. James was documenting everything: temperature, wind speed, ice thickness, GPS coordinates when they worked, and most importantly, audio recordings of the ambient sounds. He wanted data that could be analyzed, studied, and used to create a reliable navigation system. "It's weird," David said after about a mile. "I've lived here my whole life, and I never thought about actually understanding the drift. It was just this scary thing we avoided." "That's how humans deal with a lot of things," James replied. "When we don't understand something, we create stories about it. The stories help us cope with the fear, but sometimes the stories keep us from finding real solutions." They were approaching the 3-mile mark when the weather changed. Not dramatically, there was no storm, no sudden fog. But clouds moved in, and visibility decreased from miles to maybe a few hundred yards. "You want to turn back?" James asked David. The young man shook his head. "I want to keep going." But carefully, they continued forward, and that's when James started hearing them again, the whispers. In the daylight, with another person beside him, they seemed less supernatural but no less strange. The sound rose and fell, creating that eerie impression of distant voices. "You hear that?" David asked, his voice tight. "Yeah, don't fight it. Just listen. Pay attention to how it changes." James pulled out his recorder and started documenting the sounds again. He had David make noise, shout, clap, rev the snowmobile engine, and then they'd both listen to how the sounds echoed back. "It's like the ice is talking," David said, wonder creeping into his voice despite his nervousness. "In a way it is. It's telling us about its structure. Hear that low tone when you're facing east? That means there's probably a large cavity system that way. The high-pitched whistle when you face west? Probably tighter ice formations." They mapped the acoustic landscape carefully, James creating a rough diagram of what the subsurface structure might look like based on sound alone. It was crude, but it was real science. This could be replicated. This could be taught. About 5 miles in, David's snowmobile hit a soft patch. The engine revved, but the machine didn't move forward. It was sinking slowly into slush. "Stop," James called out. "Don't give it more gas. You'll just sink faster." They spent 20 tense minutes carefully extracting the snowmobile, using boards and rope to distribute the weight. It was exactly the kind of normal Arctic danger that had nothing to do with whispers or curses, just bad ice and poor luck. Once David was clear, they took a break. James checked in with Tom via satellite phone. "We're good. 5 miles in, dealing with some soft ice, but we're managing. Weather's holding." "Copy that. Henry wants me to tell you that you're an idiot." James smiled. "Tell Henry that his concern is noted." They continued forward, and the crossing became almost routine. The whispers were still there, still strange, but with understanding came a loss of fear. They were just sounds now, data to be collected and analyzed. That's when they saw it. A snowmobile sitting abandoned on the ice, half covered in snow and frost. Old, maybe years old. David went pale. "Is that someone from before?" James said quietly. "One of the 15. They approached carefully. The snowmobile was ancient, probably from the early 2000s. There was no sign of the rider, just some scattered supplies frozen solid. A thermos, a rope, a pack of emergency flares that had never been used. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was where someone had died, or at least where they'd abandoned their vehicle before dying somewhere else. This person had family, friends, a life, and they'd gotten lost in this white emptiness and never made it home. "We should mark this location," James said. "GPS coordinates, so it can be recovered later properly." David nodded silently. They took the coordinates and a few photos, then moved on. But the discovery had changed the mood. This wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. Real people had died here. The last 2 miles to the mainland were the hardest. Not because of the ice conditions, but because of what they were carrying. The weight of all those lost lives. All that fear. All those years of superstition and grief. When they finally reached the mainland shore, David actually cheered. James just felt tired and oddly sad. "We did it," David was saying. "We crossed the drift. We mapped it. This is incredible." "Yeah," James said. "We did." They checked in with Tom, then turned around to head back. The return trip was the true test. Could they use their new acoustic map to navigate the same route in reverse? Could they find their way even if conditions changed? On the way back, fog did roll in. Not as thick as James's first crossing, but enough to reduce visibility significantly. The whispers came back louder now, and for the first time James saw David struggle with fear. "It sounds like my grandmother," David said, his voice shaking. "The whispers. They sound like her calling my name." "That's your brain trying to make patterns," James said firmly. "It's not real. Focus on the tone, not the words you think you hear. Listen to the pitch. What direction gives you the complex harmonics?" David closed his eyes, listening. "That way," he said, pointing. "Good, now we move that direction. Trust the science, not the fear." They navigated by sound, by the acoustic map they'd created, by careful attention to how echoes bounced off ice structures. And it worked. They found their way through the fog, through the whispers, through the section where someone had died years ago in confusion and terror. When they emerged on the village side, the sun was setting. The whole village was waiting on the shore, dozens of people standing in the cold to see if they'd made it back. When James and David pulled up on their snowmobiles, alive and safe, the cheering was deafening, but James was looking at Henry. The old man stood apart from the crowd, his face unreadable. Their eyes met, and James saw something there. Not acceptance exactly, but maybe the beginning of a question where before there had only been certainty. Julie hugged both of them. "You're crazy, you know that? Both of you. Crazy and brave." That night the village threw an impromptu celebration. People who'd barely spoken to James before now treated him like family. David was a hero, the young man who'd faced the legendary drift and come back with knowledge. But as James sat in the community center, surrounded by warmth and laughter and acceptance, he felt hollow. He'd proven his theory. He'd crossed the drift twice. He'd probably saved future lives. So why did he still feel lost? His phone buzzed. A message from his ex-wife. "Maya told me what you did. That was brave. Maybe talk to your daughter? She won't admit it, but I think she's impressed." James stared at the message for a long time. He'd crossed the drift. He'd faced the whispers and survived. But the hardest journey wasn't across the ice. It was the one that led back to the people he loved.